Hello. Good afternoon from the United States and good evening to those of you joining us from Italy, from Europe, elsewhere in Europe, and from the Middle East. My name is William Wechsler, and I'm director of the Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Welcome to today's virtual event, which is a joint Italian Institute for International and Political Studies and Atlantic Council initiative held in the framework of the Rome-Med dialogues. For a number of years now, it's been an honor for the Atlantic Council to partner to tackle important issues in the MENA region and transatlantic relations. This event coincides with the publication of our new joint report, The Politics of Pandemics, Evolving Regime Opposition Dynamics in the MENA region. This report assesses the dire effects of the COVID pandemic on states throughout the region, typically laying bare and often exacerbating their pre-existing political, social, and economic weaknesses and shortcomings. We've seen another wave of protests in many places, and sadly, too often repressive reactions from governments. These dynamics will not simply disappear as the vaccines are distributed throughout the coming year. And so they will continue to challenge both local governments and policymakers in the United States, in Europe, who maintain both humanitarian concerns and vital interests in the region. Next month's inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden in Washington will offer a really important opportunity for greater cooperation between the United States, between Europe, and multinational organizations on these important matters. We're very fortunate to have Karim Mezran, who works with me at the Atlantic Council, and Annalisa Portugela lead this project for us, and you'll hear from Karim shortly. But first, I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers who have joined me today for a brief discussion on the region and what roles the US, the EU, and the UN should play in the years ahead. Very briefly, Senator Chris Murphy has served as a United States Senator from Connecticut since 2013. He's a key member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was, those of us in Washington know, he was openly discussed as a potential US Secretary of State. He previously served in the US House of Representatives, and before that in the Connecticut General Assembly. He graduated from Williams College and the University of Connecticut School of Law. Dr. Ghassan Salamé served as the UN Secretary General's Special Representative and head of the UN support mission in Libya until very recently. He also served at the UN as a political advisor to the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq, a senior advisor to the Secretary General as well. For most of his career, Dr. Salamé is a professor of international relations at Sciences Po in Paris, and where he's the founding dean of the Paris School of International Affairs. I'm honored to be the moderator for today's discussion. Without further ado, I'm going to pose my first question to Senator Murphy. Senator, you've written and spoken at length about what a progressive foreign policy should be for the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about what exactly that means for the Middle East and North Africa, and even more specifically, how should the U.S. balance its commitment to longstanding values and its longstanding interests in a region that's deeply challenged and compounded today by the pandemic?
Well, William, thank you very much for bringing us together. Really honored to be here with Dr. Salamé, a big fan of the work that you have done around the world, in particular of late in Libya. And thank you to all of our sponsoring entities for the chance to have this dialogue today. You're right, William. I have been an advocate of what I and a handful of others call progressive foreign policy. And the effort here is to make the case, particularly to the Democratic Party, but now with the Democratic president, to the country writ large, that the United States can be a force for good in the world, that there is no domestic priority that progressives have, whether it be wage growth or climate change or the health of our democracy, that doesn't have a foreign policy component. And if you aren't engaged in the world, then you can't be healthy at home. But it also means that we should learn lessons from the past 20 years and that we should be having some kind of awakening in this country about the over-militarization of American foreign policy and the disastrous results that we have regularly gotten around the world when we have attempted to unwind complicated political problems in far-off places with brigade deployments. So a progressive foreign policy, to me, is one that has America forward deployed, that invests with allies, understanding that there are no problems in the world today that can't be solved, that can be solved alone, but also one that learns these lessons. And when we think about the Middle East and North Africa, there is no sector of the world where there are more lessons to be learned about the ways in which we have misdeployed the American military, how we have relied far too often on arms sales, the transfer of military technology to try to solve problems. And so to me, yes, a progressive foreign policy is going to require the withdrawal of American forces from places like Iraq and Afghanistan. It is going to mean that the United States should be far more judicious in the way that we sell arms into dangerous regions of the world. We should be cognizant of how selling arms to our friends often just inspires our enemies and adversaries to buy more arms and to invest in weapons programs. We don't want to be fueling these arms races if we have other choices. But it is also about figuring out how else we can be influential. In Iraq today, for instance, we are spending about 4 times as much money on military purchases for the Iraqi government as we are on economic assistance. We are having, frankly, a hard time finding enough stuff to buy for the Iraqi military to spend $1 billion a year that's appropriated. And yet there are 100 times more reconstruction projects, especially in places like Mosul, than we could ever fund with US dollars. China opens doors in the MENA region, yes, sometimes through arms sales, but mostly through economic diplomacy and statecraft, because they are just much more nimble about how they can project strength through the export of their economic system and access to their market. The United States should be able to do the same. We should be supersizing our development authorities. We should be doubling the size of USAID and the State Department. Well, some of our allies in the region may be a little bit unhappy if the security partnership is slightly more nuanced or slightly smaller or less generous than it has been. I think there are other ways that we can maintain these relationships. Lastly, we just have to reemerge as a constant irritant on the issue of human rights and democracy. We are not going to play a zero-sum game in the Middle East in which if you don't immediately make yourself like an American-style democracy with full participatory rights for your citizens, you're going to have relations cut off with the United States. But it has always been to our benefit, and I think to the world's benefit, for the United States to always have human rights, freedom of the press, and democracy promotion on the agenda when we're talking to Egypt, when we're talking to the Saudis, and we have to put all of those conversations back into the mix, not expect a sea change, but understand that progress on a yearly basis is enough in that region of the world. So that's, I think, what underlies a progressive foreign policy vision in the Middle East and North Africa.
Well, thank you very much. Dr. Salamé, just picking up on something that Senator Murphy, stressed there in the human rights and democratization, the region has long been challenged in this regard. The pandemic is not helping. Can you help all of our viewers understand what the long-term impact of the pandemic is going to be in this regard? Oh, you're still on mute.
I'm sorry. Thank you for this invitation to be again in the Med Dialogue. Thank you for being with Senator Murphy on this panel. I would like to say that contrary to what happened in the United States, where certainly the pandemic has had its effect on the elections, or in Europe, where it incited a big dialogue, a big debate between public health conditions and economic recovery conditions, We haven't seen such a debate in most of the Middle East countries. What we have seen is something somehow more dangerous, in the sense that first, the trust in government has weakened even more. Many governments in the Middle East kept saying that COVID is non-existent in their countries, in their societies, while news from hospitals, from families, from cemeteries were absolutely different. Where we knew that hundreds of people were passing away, were dying, and the governments were in a state of denial, which weakened even more the trust citizens usually have or should have in their government. The second point, which is important, is that the pandemic has added to the paucity and poverty of public health equipment in many, many countries. Yemen was mentioned, but many other countries have suffered. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, my country, Lebanon, and many other countries have suffered from the fact that they were not equipped to have the ICU rooms needed for that, the machinery needed for that, and certainly the vaccine. Although in the Middle East, some richer, wealthier countries are way ahead on that. In one country in particular, vaccine has been dispensed already in large numbers, in tens of thousands, to the population, which is not the case of the other countries. One thing that is, in my view, important is that the fact that it will not have a short-term political effect, but it will have very serious midterm and long-term effect, in the sense that those governments will not be able, because of the price of the pandemics, to continue to play the role of welfare state. Welfare state is a very costly state, and with the price of oil, which is low, around $40 to the barrel, and nobody's expecting it to go much, much higher in the next few months and years, and with the fact that population growth is very high, with the fact that a lot of countries are spending too much on their military, as Senator Murphy has just said, the possibility for these governments to offer the kind of social and economic services that are expected by the population in a welfare state will be almost impossible. And therefore, yes, some kind of social unrest is to be expected in many of these countries because of this extra burden of the pandemics over public services that were already under-equipped, understaffed, and certainly not updated to the state of the art.
Thank you very much. Senator Murphy, another dynamic that complicates U.S. relations with the region even further is the increasing politicization inside the United States of our policies towards the region and of the countries in the region's approach to the United States. I mean, it wasn't, for decades, this was a completely bipartisan issue, largely. And today, many longstanding partners in the region, Israel, Turkey, Egypt, countries in the Gulf, didn't do much to hide their clear preference for President Trump in our last election, and the Republican Party more generally. How did we get to this place? And what does it mean for an incoming Biden administration?
Well, I think it's a very important question. Much of that answer is rooted in the current dynamics of American politics. And we can do a seminar in and of itself on what has happened in this country to cause this chasm, this division between the two parties and between the American electorate. A lot of it is about the American campaign finance system. A lot of it is how the media covers politics today. Much of it is about how congressional districts are drawn. But we certainly have a bigger division, and it has come to encompass foreign policy as well. I think that there are a couple things that we can talk about right now. First is a willingness on behalf of both parties to value continuity. That means making the decision as an incoming administration or as the opposing political party in Congress to support certain policies of the last administration that may not be perfect, right? But are important to effectuate in the interest of not forcing the rest of the world to engage in this sort of yo-yo or roller coaster of American foreign policy. And I think it's important for Democrats and for the Biden administration to pick some areas of Trump's foreign policy that they may disagree with, but are not so cataclysmic that they couldn't continue, to show a signal that we are going to place some value on continuity. Now, Trump, of course, had a perfect opportunity to do that in the Iran nuclear agreement. He could have objected to the agreement, but decided to stay inside of it as a means to show that continuity. He did not. I would hope that there may be an opportunity for President-elect Biden to make a gesture like that. But second, there are some decisions being made right now by the Trump administration that are incredibly alarming. The number of major decisions that this administration is making in a lame duck Congress that seek specifically to try to bind the Biden administration to limit their choices. I'm talking about the withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan, the arms sale that's been announced to the UAE, the potential naming of the Houthis as a terrorist organization. These decisions, frankly, exacerbate this politicization of American foreign policy, because it shows that even after an election, a president is going to try to use whatever tools is necessary to affect the foreign policy choices of the next administration. And so I was on the phone with the State Department as late as yesterday, pleading with them to slow down these last-minute changes, because I think that will give us the chance to talk about this value of continuity when the new administration is sworn in.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I think there's an awful lot more we could have if we had more discussion we could have on that if we had more time. Dr. Salamé, I want to talk also about these other countries. Many of them in the region have over the last decade or so significantly expanded their military operations outside of their borders. The US does it, France does it, other countries, Iran, Turkey, Russia, Qatar, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, either have forces engaged outside their borders in the wider region or providing support to local forces, or both. This is something you talked a lot when you were special representative. How can this process be reversed, both in Libya and more generally across the region?
Well, you have what I call the deregulation of force. This is a process that is hitting the Middle East big time, which means what? Which means that we were used to a large extent to intervention by great powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, etc., or the old colonial powers. What we have seen in the past few years is that there is a deregulation of force in the sense that whoever has the means to interfere somewhere else is doing it. So you have new players from the region interfering very much in the regional affairs. And this takes sometimes direct interference by using your airplanes to go and hit another country. This is happening, but more subtle ways also are happening. Financing wars is taking place at a very large scale in Libya and elsewhere. More importantly, the use of mercenaries is very serious. We estimate the number of mercenaries on both sides in Libya today to be beyond 20,000, and sometimes playing a major role in the fighting on the front line. And those mercenaries sometimes come from the country paying for them, but more often than not, they are hired from third countries, which means that you have a triangular game of people paying for mercenaries from one country A to go and fight in country B. That is why when we met in Berlin summit in order to try to find a solution to the Libyan crisis, we put the return of mercenaries to their homes as a number one objective, because they are changing to a large extent. They are a violation of the country's sovereignty, but they are changing the balance of power, the natural balance of power you would have in these societies. So you have all kinds of interference. You buy weapons, you sell weapons, you give weapons, you give money, you pay mercenaries, you interfere directly in the fighting. And we have seen all this in many countries of this part of the world. In Syria, certainly, and in Libya, even more, because the military manpower in Libya is limited due to the fact that the population is not a very big one. Therefore, yes, I was happy to hear Senator Murphy saying that a demilitarization, a relative demilitarization of US policy could be an example for other countries to go back into diplomatic means as a way of solving problems. The military cannot solve all problems. In fact, most of the problems are exacerbated by military interference rather than solved by military interference. And that is why I hope that the Biden administration is not just a chapter 3 in the post-Cold War democratic presidency in the United States after Clinton and Obama, and there is now a chapter 3 where continuity is the game. I hope some of the decisions taken under Mr. Clinton and under Mr. Obama are revisited in order precisely to demilitarize the US foreign policy and to invite other big and small countries or medium countries to demilitarize their relationship to their neighbors in the Middle East.
It seems like we have a concurrence of views between our two speakers here, which is always nice to see. Senator Murphy, we're getting close to the end, but I did have one other question that I wanted to ask you. More generally, there are a lot of people from the region watching. Tomorrow, as part of the Med Dialogue, I'm going to be interviewing the Saudi foreign minister. I'm interested in your advice to Saudi Arabia and to other countries in the region who want to have a better relationship with the incoming Biden administration. How should they be approaching the United States? What plan should they have underwork in order to solidify the relationship as much as possible? In the context when, during the campaign trail, President-elect Biden promised to make Saudi Arabia a pariah. He called Turkey Erdogan an autocrat. Pretty powerful language. What should they be doing?
Well, to dovetail with Dr. Salamé's point, which was very well made, placing a priority on de-escalation will make you some very quick friends in the Biden administration. And there are pathways to de-escalation in Libya and in Yemen. Syria is a bit harder, but there's a pathway there as well. And so if you are meeting with the incoming Biden administration and explaining how you are going to demilitarize your response in Yemen or inside Libya, and the concessions that you are willing to make, the pressure you were willing to put on proxies in order to get to a solution, you will have a lot of open doors. I've probably been the loudest critic of Saudi Arabia in the United States Congress over the last decade. But if the Saudis have a workable plan to achieve a political solution and a ceasefire in Yemen, I will convert to a cheerleader for the Saudis, at least for the time being, so they can win friends through de-escalation. Second, as I mentioned, I think you're going to have to step up on human rights and democracy. Just going to be hard for Egypt to be able to get much from this Congress or this administration if they continue this campaign of brutal repression, if they continue to lock up Americans and those with American connections. So you are able under the Trump administration to essentially ignore issues of human rights and civil rights. That is not going to be the case under a Biden administration. Again, I think that this team, as well as their allies in Congress, will be realistic about the pace of reform, but reform will be expected in order to continue, I think, robust and good and consequential relations with the United States.
Thank you very much. Dr. Salamé, one of the pathways of de-escalation that both of you have talked about is of course underway right now in Libya. I can't end this conversation with you without talking very specifically about Libya. It's one of the few places where the pandemic has actually helped to bring about perhaps a fragile ceasefire, although that was the product of extensive negotiations. Do you think the ceasefire can hold? What's your prediction looking ahead?
It can hold. It's still fragile. It can be reversed, but it can hold. But for that, you need to really maintain it. And you cannot maintain it by saying, we have a ceasefire agreement. This is not enough. You need to start doing things that consolidate that ceasefire by opening the coastal road, by opening the shuttle airplanes between the various cities in the country, by allowing the civilian population that has been displaced to go back home. So you need to do things in order to consolidate the ceasefire. Otherwise, the ceasefire would be a nice thing that will be slowly weakened by lack of progress for the regular people. Now, there is, out of the Berlin Conference, a military commission, the 5+5 commission, that has had 6 meetings. The latest one took place in Sirte inside Libya, and I hope it stays in Libya, and I hope it goes forward in implementing the departure of the mercenaries, the opening of the roads, the exchange of prisoners, all these things they have agreed upon. The relationship between the sponsors and the proxies is much more complicated than we think. Very, very often people believe that proxies are in the hands of their sponsors. This is not true. Sponsors use proxies, but proxies very often manipulate their own sponsors into bringing them into more activity to their side in this kind of conflict. We have a ceasefire in Libya. The ceasefire, if it's left to itself, will remain extremely fragile. We need to go forward and implement the various decisions taken in Berlin and taken in Geneva in order to make it. And we need to support it with the 2 other tracks. The economic track first, that calls for an audit of the central bank, that calls for the unification of economic and financial institutions.
Am I the only one that has lost the audio?
Yeah, I can't hear him anymore.
Prepare the country for the elections of December 24th, 2021. The Libyans have decided will be the date for their presidential and parliamentary election.
Thank you very much. I think we had just a little bit of technical difficulties at the end there. We heard most of what you said, but at least I didn't hear a little bit in the middle. But in the interest of time, I want to very much thank you, Dr. Salamé. I know you're going to be sticking around a little bit more, and thanks Senator Murphy for a really interesting conversation here that spanned a great variety of topics of critical interest in the region. I'm going to turn now this discussion to my colleague, Dr. Karim Mezran, who is going to continue the discussion with some of important experts from the region. Over to you, Karim.
Thank you very much, Will. Thanks a lot. Really an exceptional discussion, extremely interesting. That we are ready to continue, as you were saying, with 3 of the best experts on the Middle East and scholars. They are all very well known: Dalia, Ghanem, Abbas, Khadim, and Kristina, Kausch. But for the sake of time, I will briefly introduce them. Dalia Ghanem is a resident scholar at the Malcolm Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. She is focusing her work on the political extremism, violence, radicalization, Islamism, and jihadism, with a focus on Algeria. She is the author of several publications on Algeria, plus infinite number of articles and presence and speakers and so on. She's a very well-known scholar. Dr. Abbas Khadim, he is the head of the Atlantic Council's Iraq initiative. Between 2014 and 2018, he has served as a senior foreign policy fellow at Johns Hopkins University SAIS. Before that, he taught at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, as well as at Stanford University. He's the author of a very important book on Iraq, which is Reclaiming Iraq, the 1920 Revolution and the Founding of the Modern State. Kristina Kausch is senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund Brussels office, divided her time between Brussels and Madrid. Her research focuses on Europe's relations with its neighborhood and broader geopolitical trends in the Middle East. Prior to joining the GMF, she had positions with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Spanish think tank FRIDE, the Bertelsmann Foundation. She's also a very well-known scholar for her writings, and her op-ed and comments appear on many newspapers and journals, from the Financial Times to the Guardian to the. We are also very glad, I should say, that Professor Salamé has accepted to stay longer and will participate to this debate with his own extremely important comments. I would like to start with Dalia. Dalia, how is the COVID-19 pandemic impacting Algeria? And in particular, the focus of our report is the relationship with, or the utilization of COVID in the relationship between oppositions and the regime. What are the current and future effects of its spread on the Iraq movement? And how the economic consequences of the pandemic will impact the government's legitimacy? Dalia?
Yes. So hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to try to answer a few of these questions. With the first one, how the COVID-19 impacted Algeria, but also the Iraq and the economy of the country. So as I wrote it as early as March 2019, shaken by a popular and peaceful movement that has resisted time and divisions and intimidation and even repression sometimes, and also a presidential election, the country leadership lacked trust, as a matter of fact, today to face the COVID-19, and it lacks also the sanitary and the economic means to face the disease. So to start with the trust, there is the social capital that is needed for any political system. Public trust in Tebboune and his government were so low at the beginning of the pandemic that when the pandemic started, the Iraq, the popular movement, did not want to stop its demonstration. And despite calls to stop and to refrain, the people went down on the street and they took up to the street for the 56th Friday. And actually, it took, if I may say, trust in Algerian authorities was so low that it took artists, a football player, musicians, writers to convince the Algerian population not to take up to the street. And so this shows you how trust is lacking or has been lacking between the population, the citizen, and the leadership for a while. But in addition to that, the country was unprepared for such a pandemic, as the health system in Algeria, coupled with a dysfunctional bureaucracy, has been in a poor state for years with several shortages. So the healthcare sector in Algeria, basically, in a few words, is mainly state-run, developed, of course, with a focus to guarantee free access to everyone. But again, the quality is not there. And this health system faces major challenges: poor and inconsistent services, a lack of operational medical equipment, a shortage of medication, and weak planning, organizing, and monitoring mechanism. So we have, on one hand, the lack of trust. On second hand, we have a health system that is poorly handled and heavy bureaucracy, and we have the economy. a bad economy. So as a hydrocarbon-rich country dependent on oil and gas for 95% of its export revenues, Algeria is highly vulnerable to the fluctuation in oil prices. So as such, its economy was performing poorly, and I insist on that. It's not the COVID that made the economy go bad. It is actually the economy was performing poorly even before the March 2020 oil price crash, and even before the pandemic. Just to give you one tiny example, for instance, pipes gas supplies to Spain. Spain, that is a key customer for Algeria, were down 48% in the first 2 months of 2020, before Spain was hit by the coronavirus. Same things goes for Italy. So even as oil prices are collapsing, there has been a growing need to spend more money to address the pandemic, with more than 83,000 confirmed cases and 2,400 deaths as of today. The Algerian authorities have to spend more and more money to face this pandemic. And so to manage this pandemic, the Algerian authorities tried, to compensate for the sharp decline in oil export revenues, and the government has been drawing on its foreign reserves, and it is likely to continue doing so as the pandemic is drags on in the country. So over the past 6 years, the reserves of foreign exchange in Algeria have been dramatically depleted, falling by $132 billion from $194 billion in 2013. And according to local media, Algeria reserve will be gone by 2021, the beginning of the year. So, of course, in this increasingly difficult fiscal environment, the Algerian authorities has been, trying to find solutions, making cuts, although without referring to them as such. Instead, they've been speaking of rationalization of spending. And one tiny example was that the government announced it would cut its budget by 30%, only to declare 2 months later that it was going to actually reduce it by 50%. So there is a cacophony that is actually adding the lack of trust towards these authorities. So not to be too long, additional cost-saving measures, included, for instance, the end to use foreign expertise, which, according to the presidency, will help to save $1 billion, which shows that actually the government is just trying to find whatever it takes to save money and to be able in the upcoming months to face the pandemic, but also to avoid the social clash. Of course, there is a looming backlash. The Algerian authorities misused the surplus that they accumulated during the 2000s, overspending without clear priorities in an effort to buy social peace. And this is one of the reasons also why Algeria did not witness the Arab Spring in 2011. So it was spending to buy social peace without any view for the long term. So growing anger at the regime and the failure of its successive governments gave rise to the Hirak, the popular movement, the peaceful popular movement that we've seen on February 2020, 2019, which resulted, as you may know, in the resignation of President Bouteflika and the jailing of many business tycoons and so on and so forth. But again, the situation is pretty bad, as an IMF official told me recently, explaining the situation on Algeria. He said Algeria has sufficient buffers to accommodate the crisis in the short term. The longer the crisis lasts in the rest of the world, and the greater the risks are are for the Algerian economy. So I will end on this. I would say that, the expected sharp slowdown in economic growth in the coming months will lead to an increase in an already persistently high unemployment rate and a fall in incomes. Worsening social and economic condition will only heighten the importance of the social question that hasn't been, brought up within the demands of the Hirak. And I believe that once the Hirak again takes to the street after the lockdown measures are lifted, the regime will struggle with greater unrest. The government has no more fiscal room left to transform the structure of Algeria's economy. And worse than that, the biggest problem here, it's not the disease that the pandemic is, it's the disease of repression, as the Algerian government has been, showing a pattern of escalation in repressing and jailing activists, random and normal ordinary citizens, but also journalists and so on and so forth. So the coming period, I believe, will test the government's capacity to adjust and the regime's ability to maintain itself.
And the international community to keep a good eye on what is going on inside Algeria. Thank you very much, Dalia. Abbas. Last year, Iraq experienced a mass social mobilization against corruption and employment denigration to public service, to which the government responded with repressive measures. How did the pandemic change the social mobilization? Did it have any impact on the government's attitude towards the people's demand? What is the situation in Iraq right now?
Thank you, Karim, and it's an honor to be with this group of distinguished colleagues, and thank you for including me. Iraq was having not one of its best times in the recent months. The pandemic hit the country in one of the worst times in at least its post-2003 time. If we all recall, there was a protest that you just alluded to. Iraq, of course, always had protests over one thing or another, mostly basic services, lack of government competence, and also corruption, etc. Mostly electricity had been in the past as the reason for most demonstrations, but these demonstrations were coming and going as a way of, Iraqis got accustomed to demonstrations as part of the new founded freedom in the country after the end of a long era of tyranny under the Ba'ath regime and Saddam Hussein. So this was considered, and also the narrative in the Iraqi government that this is part of the healthy environment of freedom of expression. We are democratizing, and we expect people to voice their opinion, and that's welcome so long as it's done peacefully. What changed in October of 2019, and I was visiting Baghdad mid-September to the first week of October, so I saw the first week of the protests, was that the fatalities that happened. There were clashes between the protesters and some security forces, elements, and also some other parties that are not under state control. Iraq has a lot of weapons that are out of state control, and people died. But as the time progressed, over 700 protesters lost their lives. Somewhere around 20,000 people sustained various injuries from everything from bullets to sniper attacks to or targeting to the use of a poorly manufactured and stored tear gas canisters, etc. So that changed the demands of the protesters from demanding changing the way the government is doing business, getting better governance, basic services, employment, etc., to demands that the government should resign. And that, in fact, did end up with the government resignation. Just a couple of days ago, we had the first anniversary of the government resignation. Adel Abdel Mahdi, the prime minister at the time, turned his resignation to the parliament. It was accepted. And then the government turned into a caretaker. That kind of led to coincided with another crisis, which was the escalation of U.S.-Iranian conflict, which led to several bombings. The conflict between U.S. and Iran played on Iraqi soil. The United States had a few attacks, including a high-profile Iranian general who was killed near Baghdad airport. So that added to another dimension to the crisis in Iraq. Then we went into the year, and the attack I just referred to was on January 3rd. Then we went into the year, and there was a decline in oil prices. Iraqi budget is 93% dependent on oil revenues. It's a completely and purely rentier state. Dr. Dalia was talking about Algeria being a rentier state. Iraq is a rentier state on steroids when it comes to that rentierism. Then, of course, the decline of oil prices, the protesting or protesters, and then a government that was caretaker, and the Iraqi political blocs failed to replace the resigning prime minister and his government. And they had two attempts with two candidates named by the president, and both of them failed to gain confidence in the parliament. Indeed, neither of them got a vote. So the parliament would not have a quorum in order to have the government presented to the parliament. And that continued with a government that was caretaker, that had truncated authorities, that did not have the ability to do much, including spending of money that is needed. COVID came exactly in the middle of that. We are talking about COVID hitting Iraq as early as late February, beginning March. Iraq was also having other circumstances, geopolitical mostly, and geographical circumstances. Iraq is a neighboring country to the second epicenter of the pandemic. Iran became one of the early on, before Italy and before other countries caught large fire from the COVID. Iran became another epicenter after China, and Iraqis have incredible flow of populations between Iraq and Iran. Iranians go to Iraq to visit the shrines and to visit mostly religious pilgrimage, etc. And Iraqis go to Iran also by the hundreds of thousands, and the border is very porous. Mostly Iraqis go also for religious tourism, but also for other forms of economic reasons, and also for medical treatment. And people keep coming and going. In fact, the first case that was identified in Iraq and was announced was an Iranian student of the religious seminary in Najaf who was declared to be there. So a lot of people who were visiting Iran coming back, mostly there was no testing. Iraq also happened to have a depleted healthcare system, and that's not the doing of the current government. Iraqi healthcare system, which used to be the envy of the region in the 1970s and 80s, was completely depleted during the sanctions era between 1990 and 2003. And this continued after 2003 with the corruption, mismanagement, incompetence, and also the lack of infrastructure building in the country. So the Iraqis were not that prepared. A third element that also made Iraq a candidate of a major catastrophe that thankfully didn't materialize was the fact that the government was not in charge. It could not impose curfew. It could not make people comply with any instructions. And also the Iraqi people did not take that seriously, especially when these admonitions and advices and other government regulations came against some local obligations Iraqis always had. The pandemic happened when there was little bit later happened to be a couple of religious pilgrimages to commemorate the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. This is an occasion that brings normally 15 to 20 million people to go on foot and converge on the city of Karbala. And this time also multi-million event happened where people were crammed in small place and they were breathing down each other's neck, and that happened as well. The challenges continued to compound. Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi took office in May 7. That was when the government with full authority and full capabilities was seated. But there was not much to do. As I said, they were facing a quadruple crisis, from the political division to the economic challenges to the low prices of oil, and then COVID on top of that. The government, I would say, did as extremely well compared with what the capacity that it had. Also, it received a lot of help from non-government forces. The Marja'iyya and the religious authority in Iraq had tremendous resources that put them at the disposal of the health authorities, including building makeshift hospitals, increasing hospital beds, getting oxygen available. Many Iraqi people who had factories that were closed for oxygen, they reoperated them to distribute oxygen tubes for free. So there was a manifestation of an Iraqi sort of local mobilization to meet the challenge. But as a result, Iraq lost some iconic figures, both in politics and also in other areas. Athletes, artists, some politicians, they lost their lives to this pandemic. Ultimately, I would say that Iraq did not do as bad as it was expected. The deaths of Iraq stand at about 12,340 as of latest I checked. Deaths. The worst day of recorded deaths was around June 22, when there was 122 deaths of a population of 40 million or close. And then now the recent in late or last days of November, we talk about 23 to 24 registered deaths by day. The total cases in Iraq that were announced and recorded were about 557,000 cases. So with what we were looking at Iraq and the depleted shape the country in, the lack of preparedness, the lack of political will, I think Iraq did not reach a catastrophe that some people expected based on pre-reading or forecast of what was going to happen. But still, the COVID hit the country hard in other ways, not just deaths and cases. As I said, Iraqis mostly, there are 8 million Iraqis who draw salaries from the government in one form or another. If everybody supports 5 people, that's your 40 million Iraqis. But there are also people who are totally dependent on day laborer kind of wages, or if they don't get a salary, there is no welfare system. There is no way other than, in fact, the generosity of Iraqis to one another that pulled very well in this time. But many people were hit hard if they didn't have salaries. Those who have salaries, they continued business as usual. But I think, again, it is a mixed story. There are positive and silver linings that one can point, but there are also some things that could be done much, much, much better had Iraq been preparing for situations like this in the past 16, 17 years. I'll stop here and thank you.
Thank you very much, Abbas. Very, very nice. Kristina, after the US election, do you foresee a transatlantic realignment or significant dossier on the MENA region? Which regional dossier will be the most affected by this change in the White House, according to you?
Thank you, Karim, and well, thanks for having me. It's lovely being here with all of you. I think the first point that we have to leave very clear is that the Middle East, North Africa, is not going to be the US foreign policy priority, perhaps with a slight exception of the return to the JCPOA. Otherwise, I think this is a very clear tendency. It is not even the priority of the supposed realignment or reset of transatlantic relations, which is all about COVID, climate, and China. And these are really the areas of greatest convergence. That said, so that is like the general framework. That said, there are of course a lot of expectations on the European side of areas where the US position might move closer to the European position. And as I said, I mean, the most obvious thing is the US return announcement to the JCPOA announced by Biden already. Whether and when that will happen, under which conditions is of course unclear, especially considering all the additional hurdles that the Trump administration is pushing through on the last meetings in order to make it more difficult. And also it's not clear how much convergence there will be once everybody's sitting out around the table on how much pressure to put on Iran for to amplify the agreement on. It's not clear what the Iranian position will be, especially considering the upcoming elections in Iran and presidential elections. So there's a lot of question marks. But in principle, that is, of course, like the main area of convergence. Other areas of convergence that and opportunities consequentially that open up from this are where there's a big sigh of relief, of course, on the Israel-Palestine dossier from the Europeans, because the Biden administration is expected to basically reestablish a balance again, and bringing back the Palestinians onto the table, bringing them back diplomatically, restoring aid, and so on and so forth. Yet I don't think that on either side there is great expectations that anything big is going to move on this dossier, even though they will restore probably the quartet and so on. But I don't think that either side thinks that this is really the place where to put most of the energies in. Then you have the situation with Turkey, which is very close to the European heart, especially right now, given the tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean between Turkey and Greece and other countries over the gas exploration. And I think there we are at a point where the EU is really and totally exhausted, and there's not few who really say hope for Biden to come and take them by the hand and talk to the Turks. I don't personally think this is going to happen the way that these people imagine, but there is a question mark. I mean, it is probable that US and EU positions on Turkey will come closer. We'll have to see how the Biden administration will basically redefine US-Turkey relations in the framework of a sort of broader rethinking these relations beyond the tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean and also in the framework of NATO. So we'll see where that leads. But I wouldn't expect the US there to take over any major leadership role. And then perhaps on the, there's also some anticipation, of course, to see how exactly this much advertised rethinking of US-Saudi relations will turn out beyond stressing human rights more than the Trump administration or at all, because of the possible withdrawal of support to the Saudis for the Yemen war and what impact that might have on the on the Yemen war, of course. And finally, I would perhaps also underline more of the sort of general, and that brings us close to the topic of this panel, the general expectation that things will be managed not by bullying and by pressure, but by diplomacy, which is, of course, what the Europeans understand, like their brand, so to speak, of more soft power than hard power, more talking, diplomacy, dialogue, in order to get things done. I don't think that the US will, that there's going to be much convergence on the North Africa file, on Libya, much US in terms of much US engagement that will kind of alleviate the burden on the European shoulders of basically establishing security in their neighborhood in their own right. I think there's still an expectation from the European side that this is going to happen. I don't think it will, and I think that there will be convergence, I think, on the human rights front. We've heard from my previous speakers, a lot of the ways, and also was in your report, a lot of the ways in which the pandemic has led to the manipulation and instrumentalization of the pandemic for greater repression, for repressive legislation, and so on. In that sense, it reminded me a lot of times of basically the pandemic is the new terrorism as a fig leaf for authoritarian regimes to hide behind and not being asked any further questions on the repression. And I think in that sense, there will be great alignment. I think both the US and the EU will be outspoken, but I really think that in the current geopolitical situation, I wouldn't expect that sort of normative support to go much beyond human rights. I don't think that either the EU or the US will be keen on pushing a lot for systemic change in the region right now, especially for the EU, because it is like caught in this coming of age situation where it has to find out how it can get, take responsibility for its own neighborhood, which comes in the context of this whole ongoing the inner European debate on strategic autonomy, strategic sovereignty, and so on. And I think this is really where there's very little room for democracy promotion and a return to that kind of agenda that we had in a very different geopolitical environment just in the pre-Trump era.
Thank you very much. This is a very important point. We are running short of time. So I would like for the three of you to address, as a consequence of what you just said, Kristina, are we condemned to authoritarianism in the Middle East? Are we condemned to a politics of repression with the international community being more or less accomplice of the dynamic of the authoritarian state and the people here and there trying to find a way for their own freedom, for their own expansion of their own rights? What is going to happen? But before starting with the tour, there's a question I have to put to ask Professor Salamé. Now that you have finished your Libya project, your Libya task, what would you have done differently, Professor? When you sum up all the things that happened, what would you have changed? What would you have done differently? What would you recommend your successor to do to be more successful? Is there anything that you really regret or would change? Are you there, Professor? No. Okay, maybe he left. Then let's go back to Dalia. The question I posed before for the three of you to debate, if you can.
Yes,
This
sure.
is this dynamic between authoritarianism and international consensus that let's not change the system, let's not do that, and the people pressures more or less strong in almost every state, trying to come out with a different system.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that in Algeria, in Lebanon, whatever you have idea?
Yeah,
Dalia.
I think this is true because it happened in 2011 and it didn't happen in some countries. And then we had what some call the second wave of the Arab Spring. So we've witnessed countries like Iraq and Lebanon and Algeria and Sudan that had a popular movement. And I think what is interesting in that is how each movement learned from its own mistake, from the past of every country, and how they learned from each other. It was very interesting, for instance, to see that when the Sudan revolution happened, it was happening also in Algeria, and both country and both popular movement were using the same technique. They were insisting on the peacefulness of the movement. They were insisting on the relationship between the military and the security forces and the people, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a pattern, and this is a trend that we are going to witness for the upcoming months and maybe years. However, as you said it, what is worrying or worrisome is that we have population that are resilient, but in front of them we have regimes that are very resilient as well. If we speak about the Algerian case, for instance, we have a regime that has been, there since the independence of the country in 1962, that adapted. Okay, we went from a fully authoritarian regime under Boumediene, then to a semi-authoritarian with an infitah in 1989. And then we had a regime today that is neither fully democratic nor fully authoritarian, and that is mixing between, democracy and authoritarianism. And so the question is, with this popular movement that has been going for a year and that has been peaceful, not attacking police, not attacking security forces, what is the regime going to do? Are we going to witness, a coming back to the old tactics, to the old, self, if I may say, and going back to authoritarianism, or are we going to see a regime that is also going to readapt? And if adaptation there is, what kind of forms it can have? Well, we've seen this regime in 2011, for instance, delivering reform packages and buying social peace. But today in 2020, there is no more money. And so the carrot and the stick policy is no longer going to work. So what is left is the stick. So the question is, to what extent they are going to use repression? And unfortunately, with all what's going on in Europe, I believe that Europe is going simply to turn a blind eye to repression if this is going to happen, simply because—
As they did in the early 90s.
Exactly.
So you don't believe that the referendum, the changing of the constitution, all the stuff is going to be anything meaningful?
No, on the opposite, I think the referendum was a very bad move. And for the regime, the referendum and the new constitution they were designed to break the momentum of the Hirak by trying to appropriate its objective. So it's very interesting to see that, for instance, in the preamble of the referendum, the Hirak, the blessed Hirak was mentioned, and the preamble said that this is a constitution that is an answer to the will of the people expressed through its authentic blessed Hirak. And this is something that Algerians didn't appreciate at all. The effort by the regime to regain popular legitimacy did not persuade the population. On the opposite, choosing the symbolic date of November 1st, which is the date of the beginning of the War of Independence against the French, was a horrible move, as a matter of fact, because Algerians, a majority of them said, actually, our independence has been spoiled and hijacked by you, and 50 years later, you are still hijacking it. So I think, and what is very important in the case of Algeria is that we have a missing president. We don't know where is the president. It's been more than 25 days.
It's kind of a deja vu.
Yes, exactly. This is a kind of deja vu. We've seen it with Bouteflika in 2013, and then again and again. And so the population, many of my friends are saying, for instance, in Algeria, actually, we get rid of Bouteflika, but the fifth mandate is happening without him.
True. Thank you very much. Abbas.
Okay, well, I don't know, Iraq is different than some of the countries in the Middle East that we cannot now classify it as an authoritarian state anymore, thankfully. But there is another problem in Iraq right now, we moved from a state with absolute authority and will to use it in a cruel way, brutally, to a government that has unhealthy lack of authority. There is no authority in Iraq in the hands of the government. There are many forces inside Iraq that have more power, more clout on the political side. They have more effective guns because they are willing to use them without accountability. And the government is held hostage sometimes in a way, but the government itself is not an authoritarian. That kind of led to a less effective government ability to deal with something like the COVID pandemic. And in an awkward way, countries with more authoritarian regimes, they were able to implement some of the measures to contain COVID better than a government like Iraq, for example, when there is lack of authoritarianism. Because let's face it, all what we have to face COVID right now is not the science or the medicine. It is the ability to keep people at home and make sure that they don't do gathering, and to threaten them if they violate it, and live up to that threat. And that is more, I mean, I think authoritarian governments have an upper hand here. But to the case of Iraq, I think the COVID did something. It came as a form of blessing to the government in disguise, because as I mentioned, in October and November, the protests and the power of the people to exert influence and force the government to do something as they would like it was successful, and the government resigned by the end of November. Then came the two things. One of them is the American involvement and military escalation that moved the media away from 24/7 focused on the Tahrir Square and the other places in various provinces for the protests, to share the screen with what happened between Iran and the United States on Iraqi soil. Then came COVID, and COVID was basically, people could not gather in the streets in the way they did before. So protesters had to go home to save their lives. And then the government felt that they could breathe again. And we moved from in November and in December, where the government was seriously considering and working for true reform, legal, constitutional, and otherwise political, to a way of reversing or reverting back to the worst act of quota system and apportionment as they used to do in the past, that caused the demonstrators to come. So they were benefiting from this. But I think, in a way, Iraq is different than the other countries in terms of there is still a belief among the people at large. They don't want the system to fall. If they protest, they want either the government to fall or certain people in the government to fall. But they are still believing in the constitution, believing in the political system, believing in the democratization process. And that's a good thing as long as it lasts. That is Iraq. I think there are other countries, one can look at them country by country in the region, and each one of them had their own circumstances. And I think you could, just like Dr. Dalia mentioned about Algeria, you could even look at case studies like Jordan, like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries. Each one of them faced the pandemic and either benefited or lost from it in terms of regime longevity and the challenges that the regime faces from social and political forces that exert legitimate demands for change. But Iraq, the change is different than the nature of change that we saw in the Arab Spring, because it's a change for people who want to maintain the system, fix it, but get rid of the actors who are unruly or corrupt or incompetent.
Thank you very much, Abbas. Conclusion, Kristina.
God. Well, conclusion is I don't know what's going to happen.
We expect you to tell us.
Yeah. I think if there is systemic change, sudden systemic change somewhere in the region in the coming years, it's certainly not, or I'm pretty sure it's not going to be triggered by anything that the Europeans do, and probably also not by what the US do. So I think that is really clearly shown that the 2011 uprisings, that it's really homemade change. And I think as things are going, I hear this over and over again in the last weeks and months, that we're really in separate spaces heading towards a sort of pressure cooker environment again. So I think it's heating up again. It's not unlikely that we are actually seeing more uprisings, more explosions. What I'm worried about in this context is that unlike in 2011, we have now a situation where country after country is being turned into proxy for regional competition, where you have regional and global conflict layered over the already domestic situations, which makes it infinitely more difficult to resolve, but also adds more hurdles for domestic change. So that is really what worries me. What a combination of sort of regional proxy constellations and meddling with a new wave of uprising would mean. And finally, maybe just to say, we've been discussing mainly the sort of immediate impact of the COVID crisis, but let's also remember that the southern Mediterranean countries are all very heavily intertwined economically with Europe, that now suffers a crisis of consumption. There will be unemployment. So the sort of delayed economic impact of the COVID, COVID in Europe on the economies in the southern Mediterranean is still to come, and I think that will even, up in the temperature even more.
Well, let's hope well. Thank you very much, Kristina. Thank you very much, Dalia. Thank you very much, Abbas. It's been a great panel. Unfortunately, we have short time. I would have loved to go for another hour with the three of you. Really. Thanks a lot, and thanks to ISPI and the Atlantic Council for this panel. Have a great day and a great weekend. Thanks.
Thank you, Karim.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.